Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I see folks trickling in right now, so I'm just going to get started with an introduction. This webinar is about how to communicate company culture throughout the entire employee lifecycle. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am a senior partnerships manager here at All Voices and host of Reimagining Company Culture, our interview series. Today is Black Women's Equal Pay Day. Yes, September 21st, meaning it takes 9 months into 2022 to make what white male counterparts made in 2021. We also want to honor and recognize that we are in the midst of Hispanic Heritage Month, which was first observed in the United States in 1968. This webinar is sponsored by All Voices and GEM. For folks who aren't familiar, at All Voices, our goal is to really help companies become more inclusive and create that psychologically safe space by creating and maintaining that culture of feedback. And GEM is on a mission similarly to help companies really hire great teams. Their talent engagement platform enables recruiting teams to build relationships that lead to diverse, high quality talent pipelines and a great candidate experience and predictable hiring at scale. In this webinar, we're going to talk about many things, but a couple key takeaways we're going to talk about are communicating your company culture from the hiring process to beyond, fostering a sense of belonging, and creating a holistic employee feedback management strategy. If you have questions, feel free to use the Q&A function or submit questions via the chat. And this recording will be sent out for folks who cannot join us live as well. So with that, I will stop talking and pass it over to our panelists. If you could introduce yourselves with your name, pronouns, a little bit about you, and then we will get into the meat and potatoes of the conversation. Chayla, I'd love to start with you.
Hi, Christina. Hello, all. Welcome to the panel. I'm excited to be here. My name is Chayla Gage. Pronouns are she, her. I am the Senior Vice President of Talent, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at a company called Reformation. We focus on bringing sustainable fashion to everyone. My background is inclusive of over 25 years. I was hesitant to say it because I'm aging myself, but over 25 years of HR experience, from owning my own diversity search firm through leading global teams across US, Japan, Singapore, Poland, Brazil, and Canada. My industry experience, I am new to fashion and excited to be in fashion. My background is typically engineering within the automotive and aerospace sectors. And that's me, Christina.
Awesome. Thank you for being here. Shalisha, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Shalisha Willis. I lead the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging function at GEM. And as Christina mentioned, we're a talent engagement platform who help organizations hire great teams. And we have a real focus on diversity. So very excited to be here. Chayla did an amazing job, so it's a hard act to follow. But I got my PhD in organizational behavior with a focus on diversity and leadership, and have spent the last kind of decade plus in various HR functions, really trying to figure out how to increase diversity and inclusion, primarily in tech. And then I'll turn it over to Rebecca.
Yeah, hi, I'm Rebecca Gonzalez. My pronouns are she, her, Aya. I work at Full Story and I am a manager of candidate experience. And I also lead up our employee resource group for Latinx Full Storians called Mi Gente. Yeah, I came from restaurant industry background. And so one of my biggest joys in life is just making everything feel like a party. And I really want employees and candidates alike to feel that love and feel like they're coming to a place that really welcomes them.
Awesome. Thank you, all three of you, for being here today and for sharing your experiences and just a little bit about how we can really ensure that we're creating a best-in-class company culture for everyone. Rebecca, to your point around employees and candidates really feeling like they are loved and seen at an organization, I would love to kick it off with a general question around whether it's candidate or current employee feedback you've received. What are some of the main reasons, trends, or patterns you've seen folks interview at and stay at your organization?
I think one of the very best things about Full Story is that we have these values that we have baked in very deeply into our company culture, and it has made it really easy to invite candidates into feeling that. And so those values are empathy, clarity, bionics, and trust. And so when I thought about mapping out, right, this journey of like the candidate experience and what I want to communicate to candidates so that it feels like that seamless transition to an employee, I kind of went back to those values and how do we showcase them from day one? Um, the other thing that we hear all the time from employees and candidates alike is that the people are their favorite part. And so, really, sort of leaning into the fact that Full Story is really filled with a lot of quirky people who have interesting hobbies and passions, and really showcasing that at the forefront. So, like when you apply to Full Story, you get a playlist that is curated by Full Storians from our social music channel. And sort of sprinkling in those little Easter eggs all along the way, I think really has made the big difference.
Oh, playlist. I feel like that's fun. I want one of those. Shalisha, are you seeing something similar at GEM as well? I know I had the pleasure of working with you and a couple of your colleagues, so I've engaged with the employer brand a little bit, but would love to hear from you.
Absolutely. I would echo just about everything that Rebecca said. I think it comes down to three things, really: the people, product, and purpose, right? So people are really attracted to the product and what it does, what it can do for the industry, right? Increasing diversity and access and inclusion. And so that's a key component of it. And then the people, right? From the time that you enter into our recruiting process, you get a sense of what it's like to work at the company and how we're living our values, which is really, really important, and a sense of ownership over it. It doesn't matter if you're a leader or an intern, you feel that same sense of pride in the values, and it truly is reflected in everything that we do. And so that's really the feedback that we get, and the feedback that we want to hear about how our day-to-day and our culture is really showing up in our different processes.
Yeah, values are really important. And from day one, and no matter where you are at the organization, feeling like you are welcomed is really important. There are a lot of different points of the employee life cycle, candidate experience, from onboarding, day 90 to year 5, the exit interview. I want to ask if there's any point during the employee life cycle that you've seen or you think that sometimes folks forget to foster and plan strategically. And if so, what is it? Anyone can answer, but Shayla, I want to pass to you first.
Thank you. I think where people tend to drop the ball when it comes to the employee life cycle is in the onboarding. I've seen it. Like, you'll have your talent acquisition team do everything they can with the attraction, the sourcing of talent, making sure that they have diverse talent, bringing that talent through the door, walking them through interviews. Then you do the rounds of making sure you have the right proper offer, and then onboarding comes, and sometimes managers forget that their candidates are starting that day. Or onboarding comes and we put the candidate in front of a computer for a few hours and say, hey, here you go. Or onboarding comes and we walk them through a deck one day, and we consider day one is their onboarding. What I've seen work well is when companies take onboarding throughout the employee's first year, that 30, 60, 90, 120, 360, and being able to put their values. I love what Shalisha said about product, purpose, and I'm missing a P. Product, purpose,
People.
people. Oh, I can't believe I missed that P. Um, but making sure that those values, the product people purpose is touched on at every point. And not only are you talking about your values, and not only are you touching it at every point, but you're weaving it throughout the 30, 60, 90 days. And you're elevating your candidate, your now employee, you're elevating their experience every 30, 60, 90 days. And you're what I've seen that this does when you take your onboarding and you really think about the major touch points when in a person's first year, your engagement scores increase, hiring manager or and employee satisfaction increase. And when you don't do it, I've seen candidates or employees leave us within the first 6 months.
I think
I'll
those
leave
are
it over to the panel. Any other comments on employee life cycle?
I agree with what you said. I think it's really easy once a person steps in the door to get really tactical. And so, like you said, from onboarding to that first year, but then what I have also seen in the data is that when people hit kind of 3 years, 5 years, it really drops off in terms of engagement. And we forget, right? We get really into the day to day and shipping products and programs and forget to communicate and drive accountability for upholding values and culture. And so even beyond that, that first year is really important, but don't forget about your employees after that process and gathering their feedback and understanding the sentiment and whether your leaders are actually living the values in the day-to-day, and making those adjustments throughout the employee life cycle is so important, especially with everything that's been going on in the environment, the macro environment, that we really are able to ensure that we don't lose sight as we get into the tactical and the strategic. It should be part of the strategic, quite frankly.
Yeah,
I love that you mentioned the 3 and 5 years. Oh, I'm sorry, Rebecca.
Oh, go ahead.
I love that you, Rebecca, mentioned you're part of the ERGs, and I think our employee resource groups are a key way to help us attract but also retain talent, especially at that 3 and 5 year mark. I've also seen certain companies create cohorts of talent when they onboard. So if you onboarded in your class of 2021, then having that cohort get back together ever so often so that you have people that you can say, remember when our day one, or and you have people who are learning at the same pace that you're learning the organization. Rebecca, I'll pass it back over to you.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of double click on that sentiment about like, once people have been there for a while, like culture isn't really static. It's going to continue to change as you invite people into the organization. And so that's kind of where, like, for me, creating the hint that was important was like, wow, all of a sudden we have all this representation of Latina people, and we want to share our culture and we want to talk about things and we want to create a community that, we can come to and have people who understand us. But now it's kind of like, okay, we need to share that with the rest of the company, right? And we need to share that outwardly and make that sort of take that drumbeat of like this culture isn't static, it's going to continue to evolve, and just sort of share that out.
I love that community piece too, to feel like you are not alone experiencing this, the cohorts, and also just creating the space where you can kind of give that feedback during touch points as well. It sounds like, everybody here is really invested in creating spaces where people can thrive and do their best work. But we also know that not everybody has the same work experiences as well. Maybe there wasn't psychological safety at your last job, but now you're working at a really great company culture. And it does take time to really build that trust and kind of build that muscle up as well. For folks on the call as well, psychological safety is that belief that you won't be punished or retaliated against or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. So to put that into kind of examples, what are some of the ways that specifically managers can intentionally set up an environment on their team where psychological safety is present? What does that look like in practice? Again, open to anyone, but Shalisha, I want to pass to you first.
Oh, I love this question. I love this question because I think one of the things that we hear across leaders, across organizations, is that innovation is so important. And the thing that they miss is without psychological safety, there is no innovation. We also hear diverse teams are so important and that they lead to more innovation. They lead to higher performance. Without psychological safety, you don't realize the benefits of diversity and what a team can bring. And so when we think about what's important to really cultivate psychological safety, what managers need to do, the first and foremost is making sure they're clear in their expectations. Are we all operating under the same rules of engagement? That is taken for granted often. The second thing is modeling vulnerability and humility, right? The way that you show up as a leader is the way that your employees will show up. So, are you asking for feedback, not just giving it? Are you saying, hey, I don't know when you don't know? Do you admit your mistakes, right? Because all of those behaviors, no matter what level you're at, those are the things that create psychological safety and allow people to take risks. And then how do you cultivate curiosity? When you're in a meeting, are you just giving feedback? Are you tearing people's work down? Or are you asking open-ended questions? Are you allowing your team first to provide feedback before you give your opinion? So power in a room as a manager, when you start off and you give your opinion before you welcome feedback, that really creates what people are willing to share. And that really can undermine psychological safety if you're not careful. And then the thing that I think is probably the most taken for granted is, do you show compassion and care for your team? Are you building connections? It's not just about a cog in a wheel and a person is a number. They're a person, they have needs, they have their individual experiences. Are you taking time to build connections with your team members to make them feel comfortable and like they can show up and raise their challenges or challenge you or others? It's so important to just treat people like people. I know it seems really simple, but when we talk about psychological safety, that's a really core component of getting people comfortable in a room. But I just rambled, so I want to make sure I open it up to the rest of the panel.
I love that you brought in diversity. And I feel like there's a path towards um, inclusion and diversity, equity, and inclusion. When we bring in employees, when we talk about culture, there's these elevated steps. Psychological safety is of the same. So there's the step of, do I feel comfortable enough to share my ideas? Do I feel comfortable enough to challenge? Do I feel comfortable enough to take a risk? And psychological safety, I believe, is the foundation of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because without it, your employees who are historically underrepresented groups will not feel like they belong. And so what's amazing about this though is that psychological safety is needed from everyone, regardless of affinity, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientation. As a leader, everything that Shalisha just said, understanding your employees, vulnerability and humility, all of that goes so far with each of our employees. And it's the main reason why employees leave. There's the saying, employees don't leave companies, they leave managers. And it's because they don't feel like they belong or psychological safety does not exist.
And I think you can build that upfront in your interview processes as well. Like, we really encourage all of our interviewers to save space for questions. If you see that somebody is nervous, like, help them sort of feel comfortable. Like, we really want people to have a good experience and we really want them to feel like they can showcase themselves and their abilities, at its brightest. help them get there, be kind, be human, let them know that this is somebody that they can rely on to work with in the future and who's going to be rooting for their success if they join our organization.
I love that you just said be human.
Yeah. The other piece of what you said was just that advocacy. How are you showing up for your team? How are you showing up for candidates? Do they feel comfortable like they can be their authentic best selves at work? Are you creating that environment? Psychological safety, again, is the foundation to them feeling that way.
And I think there are ways that companies' policies and processes can help enhance psychological safety. For example, co-op bathrooms, where people can feel like, okay, my company sees me, or allowing or putting policies in place so that employees can highlight their pronouns, she, her, he, him, and having employee resource groups or culture committees in which employees can create a sense of belonging amongst themselves. So yes, it's heavy on the leader, but I also challenge those who are in charge of policies and processes to look at building in psychological safety there as well.
Yeah. One last thing, we probably could all talk about this all day, is sometimes we make these concepts really big and like they have to be changed at the highest level. But psychological safety is built in moments. So it could be a matter of spending 5 minutes during a staff meeting to allow people to build connection. In that moment, that 5 minutes will transform your collaboration, your connection on your team, and level the playing field in a way that is really powerful. And so when we think about creating psychological safety, it's not just like those big processes or programs that you have to implement. It's really in your day-to-day interactions.
It's in your day-to-day intentional interactions. And I definitely agree that it's built in moments and everybody should have that ownership mentality as well, with managers and executives really thinking critically about this too, but asking yourselves those open-ended questions when a new team member joins too, and in those moments throughout your career as well, and making sure it's one thing to say, I want to create a psychologically safe space, then how are you doing that? How are you changing that as more people come in, leave the organization, and consistently are working on that and being honest with the answers you're giving yourself to, which can be difficult. Shalisha, you mentioned kind of not treating people as cogs in a machine, really being human, which I appreciate as well. And there's been a lot of conversation around the role of work in folks' lives and how it's changing. The term quiet quitting has come up quite a lot in LinkedIn and in articles. Folks are talking about quiet quitting, which isn't physically about quitting your job or leaving. And I believe it became popular on TikTok, and some descriptors for quiet quitting include not doing the job of 2 or 3 people with a concept, not going outside of the scope of your job description, not going above and beyond or sacrificing your mental or physical health for your job as well. So I want to kind of ask in relation to our discussion, do you think that this is something that employers should really be like urgently thinking about to use as motivation for them to really listen to employees and create a different kind of workplace that currently exists? Chayla, I will pass to you first.
Thank you. You know, I think quiet quitting is the evolution of the Great Resignation. And I believe the Great Resignation came out because when we went through COVID, there was this immediate, am I doing something at work that is going to fulfill me, that is going to fill my cup and make me whole? Psychological safety came up during COVID a lot, where managers were listening to employees. Employees started resigning from places because one, the market was just going crazy. It was employees' opportunity, and two, that connecting passion and purpose. I think quiet quitting, now that the market is softening and employees are like, maybe they are in their new roles, there's still this want to connect passion and purpose. And I believe that employers, if we're not company leaders, executives, managers, if we're not aware that quiet quitting exists, then we're silently agreeing to it. We have to speak to it. We have to make it forefront. And by doing that, what you're telling your employees is, I'm listening, I care. And sometimes you can't always connect passion with purpose, but you can allow employees to have time to go after their purpose. You can bring in opportunities to volunteer. You can bring in speakers with your employee resource groups, educating, being allyship, being an ally to your employees. What I love about the term quiet quitting is it took it took what employees were feeling and made it gave it a word. It's the same as kind of micro messaging. You know, you kind of feel with micro messaging, it's the messages that are intended to either hurt or harm. There can be positive micro messages as well, but until the term micro messaging came out, people didn't know how to feel. And now quiet quitting is out, and all of those employees that were like, I'm exhausted, I'm overworked. Quiet quitting is there to say, this is what that is. And as employers, we would do well to recognize that we can create policies, processes, and in an environment in which our employees don't feel that they need to quiet quit in order to be their best selves.
Yeah. Plus one, I would say, just as a follow-up to that, quiet quitting, I'm a huge proponent of well-being. Kind of similar to all the other concepts we've talked about. If you really want high performing employees, then you need boundaries. And when we think about how we work employees in the US, it is a very US centric approach. And there are actually organizations that build well-being into their model. And so there's a lot more we could be doing to help our employees show up as their best selves again and not feel burnt out on a regular basis where we're not getting the best of them anyway. And so quiet quitting, again, as Chella mentioned, named it. People were exhausted when COVID hit. They're still exhausted because there's been such an up and down over the years. How are we enabling the success of our employees and not just thinking about what they can give to us? Like, this is really a relationship that we're building with them. And what are we giving and getting from the relationship has a direct relationship to one another. And so I think it's really important that we do a little bit more listening and not make something negative, because there's always something to learn from a new term, a new concept that has come up. And so I just urge employers to ask more about the quiet quitting and what the sentiment is of their employees and how they can do more to enable their success.
And I also think like you can give your employees something to hold on to. Something at Full Story that we have as part of our operating principles is articulate the non-negotiables, right? And so if your non-negotiables are, I have family time from 4:30 until 8 p.m. every day, that's your non-negotiable. That's okay. My non-negotiable is on Fridays after 5 p.m. You will not see me. I am enjoying my weekends, and I hope you are too. And so I think we have to think a lot about how are we building cultures that allow people to have boundaries without feeling bad about them. I think one of the things about quiet quitting that um, I found interesting is people are like, well, I'm not going to go above and beyond. And I'm like, well, is that expected of everyone at your workplace, that everyone has to go above and beyond? Or is it only certain people who feel the need to go above and beyond? And so it's kind of like asking those deeper questions, like Shalisa said, right? Like, what is causing this? What do people really want? And then giving them a culture that allows them to hang on to those things and gives them the structure that they need to be good employees and then also have a life outside of work.
The last thing I'll say here is, one thing I really urge our leaders to do is to balance the messaging, because to your point, people feel like they have to work harder because of some of the messages that are sent, which is the people who work late hours are the ones who are quote unquote high performers. What we need to do is better balance quantity with quality and impact, right? And so is it that someone who works longer hours is more committed to the job? Are they still having an impact? Or do we care most about people having an impact in the role, regardless of how many hours they spend, even if they have really healthy boundaries, right? And so sometimes there's just these unintended messages that people are receiving, and often impact underrepresented groups disproportionately. And so it's really important for us to make sure that we have policies, we have a culture and the language to support the different needs of employees.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that as well. You can have a company value of we value flexibility and really having open conversations. But if you are slacking on the weekends and the people that are promoted are the ones that are showing that they're working 24/7 or their icon is always green, what are you actually saying as well? So there needs to be alignment there too. And again, answering those questions. We do have a couple of audience questions that I want to dig into as well. One of them is around when we were talking about the candidate experience. Someone had a question around how do you, can you elaborate more on the product portion? And I'm assuming that's how you kind of talk about the product in the interview process or how that's communicated as well. So I will pass to the panelists to talk about, can you elaborate more on the product portion in the candidate experience?
I'd be happy to start off. So the full story platform is like super robust, and we talk a lot about how it delivers value not only to our customers, but like the value that our employees get from like being able to be hands-on working on concepts that are going to make it in front of a customer. You're not a cog in a machine working on something very small. You're having a real impact on leading a project that is going to lead to a new micro product or a new landing page, something that feels good for you to work on. And so we have our engineers, they have their own blog, and they talk a lot about the work that they do. And then we sort of sprinkle that through all of our candidate communications from beginning to end, sort of, you know, the impact that you can have if you work here. And this is the impact that this person had on this particular project or this micro product that we recently released. And then we celebrate those things, not only internally, but externally. And I think that that just brings a little bit of extra joy to the work that people do.
Just to add to that, the GEM product is really unique in that it focuses on recruiting, and that everyone's been through a recruiting process. And so it's really easy to make the connection between what your experience has been in the past and wanting to make that better for other people, other talent communities, and in particular, you know, underrepresented groups, and creating access in the industry. And so again, to Rebecca's point, making sure that that narrative, that discussion is part of the candidate process, and connecting back to your purpose, right? So it's bigger than just the product, but the product has purpose. The product connects to people. So it just brings those 3 Ps all together, and making sure that our recruiters and our hiring managers and our interviewers are able to speak to it, not only from what it does, but authentically about what they're doing today to have an impact. And literally everyone across the organization is asked for feedback and has an impact on our product, which is really, really special. So people knowing they're going to come in and be able to impact it, I think is a huge selling point.
I'll just add to that one of the reasons why I joined Reformation is because of our focus on sustainability, on bringing sustainable fashion to everyone. And so that is our product, that is our mission. And what I love about the company is that we bring everyone back to product at multiple times throughout their employee experience. And I think that's where, if we're talking about employee experience and employee life cycle, that is where some companies kind of miss the mark. For example, if you're a company that I used to work for made airplane engines, but not everyone made an airplane engine. There were analysts that were just responsible for the finance part of it. But the airplane engine is what was out the door. how do we bring our finance team back to understanding that the airplane engine is the product and that the product impacts our global community? And that's where I think I've seen some companies do it well and some companies have opportunity.
The product is or service is directly related to the people and the purpose, and interweaving that throughout the candidate employee experience is really important. We also talked about kind of the different parts of the employee experience that might be overlooked. And there was another question around how do you revive engagement with values after 2 or 3 years and after 5 or 6+ years at a company as well. Do you have any best practices for this question?
I have tons of thoughts. I'll give a couple. I think where we lose people at 3 to 5 years is not only the values, but whether or not they're seeing them show up. So equity, like at some point, we should be looking at whether or not people are progressing in their careers at the same rates by group. And so do they see themselves have opportunity at your company? So that's one thing that's really, really important. The other is like, how are we getting people, giving them the opportunity to build their skills? How are we keeping them engaged? And so some things that I know many organizations are looking into that we're also kind of testing out our skills marketplaces, right? Like, can you post something and a person can get a different skill set? Things like mentoring and sponsorship are also really important, but to take it outside the box, like how are you engaging people in their growth and having conversations with them and understanding what their needs are to be able to continue to meet those at 3, 5, et cetera, years is so important. And I think, again, we spend a lot of time sometimes on early career and forget about people who are in mid careers and leadership and what their needs are.
I think I love that question. There are so many ways to engage at the 3, 5, 10, 15. And I employee resource groups. I cannot speak enough on employee resource groups because I've seen ERGs really take the culture and like live it. And if people are involved in their ERGs, there's a sense of community. And the ERGs, they change and evolve probably quicker than some of the formal teams do. So I say always advocate for your employee resource group. Additionally, internal mobility. Like there are many companies where employees can have multiple careers. Just because you started off in engineering doesn't mean you can't transition through to finance or HR. And I think companies would do well to make sure that there's an internal mobility process. And then again, I loved how I think it was Shalisha that mentioned this is a relationship. Relationships get stale. And we can all, I don't know how many people have been a part of a relationship that you're at that 3-year mark, you're like, okay, we're gonna do it. How are we gonna do this? And then, or there's the relationship where the kids are now gone. And you're like, okay, I need to reinvest in you. I need to see what you're all about now. Our employees change. And the best thing about any relationship is learning to trust, learning to love, learning to appreciate and respect the person that your employee has changed to be. And so at that 3, that 5, that 10-year, that 15, we should be appreciating everything that employee has brought to the table.
I like the multiple careers at the same company as well. And similarly, I think it's Esther Perel who's like the multiple relationships you have with perhaps the same person too, especially if you've been with them for a couple of years as well. It's a relationship and it's going to change and you can't keep everything the same. So when we were talking about psychological safety, there is an anonymous question here as well around as HR professionals or really anyone who works for an organization, you are also a representative of the company. So when you talk about psychological safety, how can you make someone safe to bring up concerns when you know actions may not always be taken to their satisfaction? What is your advice there?
That is a good one, and um, I'll give an example. When we went through after the death of George Floyd, and during the during the trial, there were a lot of people of color who would come to my desk often and say, "I am tired of being the one person of color that is called on to tell my story." And at the same time, there were leaders who were saying, "I don't know how to engage with people of color." And so they would always call on that one leader or that one individual. When there are opportunities to provide clarity in the process, clarity of a role, clarity of a situation, then employees take what they need from that. And so I had a situation once where an employee said, "I'm tired of being that one." And I couldn't guarantee for them that they weren't going to be that one over and over again. What I tried to communicate with them is, do what is comfortable for you, and I will do all that I can to make sure that you are safe. Here's opportunity, here's what I can do. And I set the clarity I set up expectations of what was appropriate and also what was not appropriate. And as an HR professional, sometimes we feel like we have to take the company side. Being a human, as Rebecca said, is not recognizing the different ways in which people feel connected, or the different ways in which a solution can come to be. And being human means being a kind human means acknowledging those different ways. So even if a certain situation doesn't land the way an employee wants it to, if you've set the expectations, if you've been a kind human and listen, then I think you're on the right path.
Yeah. Further to that, I would say I have definitely been in situations where there are legal matters and there are matters that are indicative of bias that are not necessarily illegal. And often people will come and they will bring up matters that once investigated, maybe a claim is closed. But it doesn't mean that there isn't something to address. And so, what I have found to be particularly helpful is to make sure that there is a really close partnership between whoever handles employee relations and your diversity, equity, and inclusion partner, because there may be subtleties that you don't understand about the situation that are cultural that need to be addressed and clarified, to Chila's point, but may not be indicative of discrimination. And so the extent to which you can build that close partnership so you can understand what's underlying some of these things is really important to building relationships with employees and trust between HR and your employee population.
I really appreciate both of those answers to this question. I think it's something that has come up a lot over the last few years as well. And I think this is, related to a similar question where people are looking to, I think the stat is, we spend at least a third of our lives working, including sleep. And people are looking for their employers and organizations to really see, hear, and understand them. Another question is, what do you do for CEOs and leadership who may not want to speak on quote unquote social issues or be political, or something of that nature? This came up in another webinar too, and I think this is important to address, because I personally believe the political is personal. But what advice do you have for CEOs, leaders, or managers to really support folks on social issues if they're hesitant or do not want to?
Oh, I love that question. I remember being brought into a meeting and saying, "Chayla, here's our issue. Can you go talk to this employee population about?" And I refused. I'm not going to be that token black girl that takes a black issue and I'll be the person to be the voice. I do believe that in the world that we are in today, there's not an option to be quiet on your values. If you understand what your values are as a leader, as a manager, you are responsible to living in those values. Living in that value also means walking the walk and talking the talk. And I also believe it's up to leadership. It's up to, if we have employees, leaders who cannot walk the walk and talk the talk of our values, then we have to make the hard decision to exit out those employees. That's just my stance on it.
I agree. And I think sometimes we have to make the connections between the issue. First off, most social issues are human rights issues, right? And so when we talk about caring about humans, we can't be quiet on those issues. The second thing is they often directly relate to a value that we have. And so it may not be as easy, especially when they're politicized, for people to make those connections. And so for me, I see my role as building the bridge to help people understand and how silence can actually be more insidious than saying what you may think is the wrong thing. But standing in solidarity, which is allyship with communities, underrepresented or marginalized communities. And so again, it usually requires a conversation and some coaching and the right language. But I think it's really important to have that conversation. And to Chella's point, I will not be the representative for every kind of racial or gender, whatever issue that comes up. It's really important that leaders lean in, have a perspective, and communicate that out to employees.
Yeah. And, having empathy for other people is not political. You can have empathy for other people and see the struggle that they're going through without having to give your own personal opinion. And so, I would just say, like, lean into empathy. Like, sometimes things get tricky, people can get heated, but if we lean into that empathy for others and like care about the walk that they're going through, I think that always is going to land well with them.
Yeah. And I would say in leaning more into that, there's tolerance for different perspectives. We don't all have to agree on the same issue, but if we all agree on being empathetic, compassionate humans and caring about humans, then there is something to say. Those are completely different things. And I think that they get mixed up a lot.
Yeah, I think the other follow-up question that usually comes in this conversation is, do I have to say something at every social pivoting point? And I believe that if it impacts your employee population, it should be said. Multiple shootings at schools, shootings at we're not going to until different laws come to be, until we're at a different place, shootings are going to continue. So can you say something about shooting once and just have it carte blanche? I don't think so. I think there's multiple points, and I think if you're listening to your employee population, if you're caring, if you're empathetic, then you'll want to speak to that.
I think those are all, again, really thoughtful answers to that question, which is often, I think, really hard to answer if you're coming from that place as well and you're working at an organization where you feel like you have to coach or convince, for lack of a better word, folks to really have empathy as well. We have time for one more question and then a final question as well. I feel like we could talk for more than an hour, but one of the questions is around, I am currently involved in a company merger. How can we blend cultures from smaller corporations into a slightly larger, more established organization where everyone involved can be seen and heard? What are your thoughts there?
I've been a part of so many mergers and acquisitions, and you can tell a company that's been through multiple mergers and acquisitions because there are all of these little subcultures in between. I think companies that transition well acknowledge that they are bringing in multiple cultures. And I think that the big one company that now exists has to have a combination of cultures and of a combination of values that are coming from the different transitions, acknowledging that this is our new company stance. These are the values that we attribute ourselves to, and how can we each live up to those values of the new company. I also think that there's a transition time, and it's not a year. I've seen companies transition values 3, 5 years, and there's nothing wrong with that. There is an appreciation of history when you are combining companies, in my opinion.
To add to that, you have to first deal with the fear. Because when a company comes together, there's fear on both ends. And until you address that fear, you're not going to blend the two companies in any way. Part of that fear can be mitigated by being very clear in the approach that you're going to take to then bringing those two companies together and gathering feedback. Where I've seen mergers go wrong is that often they're not mergers. A company is brought in and they're expected to lose elements of their culture, and that's not the way it works. And so there has to be a transition period, but a sense of transparency and gathering feedback and giving updates on a regular basis to help people understand kind of what the process is and how you're going to approach it. And again, it's a relationship. So you're giving something, they're giving something. And if you approach it in that way, and you're honest about the fact that you don't have all the answers, but as they come up, you will give them, it makes for a much easier transition and integration. But there also has to be some intentionality in bringing those two groups together, because they will remain siloed unless you do so.
Yeah, you definitely have to address the reality of what people are feeling. Just because you don't talk about it does not mean it's not there. And also, change does not happen overnight as well. And it happens with intentional actions on a day-to-day basis, long term, and really having those conversations. The last question that we'd like to end on is a good old call to action for folks who are on the call, who are really thinking critically about how they want to communicate their individual unique company culture throughout the employee life cycle. A lot of our webinars have folks who are in human resources people, diversity, equity, and inclusion, who are typically decision makers or managers. What is your call to action for folks to really communicate their company culture throughout their employee life cycle? Rebecca, I will start with you, and you could popcorn to someone else.
I would say think really holistically about the journey that your candidates take to being an employee, and then the one that your employees take throughout their career at your company. And think about how you want to infuse each piece of that journey with culture that's going to connect them back to the stage that they're in. So like I mapped out all of our candidate communications to the process from application all the way to each rejection stage. And I thought about how I wanted candidates to feel at every stage. And then I plugged in the pieces of our culture that were going to support those feelings so that they caught those little glimpses all along the way. And then I worked with our internal comms team to make sure that that was a seamless transition once I handed them over, right? So I would say kind of take that bird's eye view, be holistic about it. Don't be afraid to like whiteboard it out, make some flow charts, and like really think about how you want people to feel at every stage. And I'll popcorn over to Shalisha.
Yes, love everything that you said. My call to action is twofold. Gather feedback all the time, regularly, not just through your engagement survey, focus groups, and employee resource groups. It is a very underutilized population that understands the communities really well and how to infuse innovation and new perspectives into the process, and how values are showing up and may not be showing up for certain communities. And so it's really important that you take different approaches to gathering feedback and including different people in the decision making. The other piece is it's not enough to measure it. There has to be accountability. And so at every part of the employee life cycle, there should be some accountability measure. At the candidate experience, you have a survey often that's going to kind of tell you how your values are showing up. Performance cycle. Is it all about just impact in certain performance measures and technical abilities, or do you have values integrated into that? Because there will be no accountability for upholding your values and your culture if it's not integrated into your performance reviews. And then again, making sure that you're gathering feedback on your managers and that you have 360-degree feedback, right? You want to be able to be looking at it from different directions. So ensuring you have accountability as well as feedback is so important. Turn it over to Chilla.
I agree with everything that both panelists have said here, Rebecca and Shalisha. I think the intentionality of mapping out the employee experience and the employee journey at your company. There are many tools available that help us with that whiteboard and that mapping that out, being accountable at each one of those points. I also think that every employee is responsible for the culture. And so in order to retain employees, the values that we expose ourselves to, that we hold ourselves to, the values that we said when you attracted that candidate, made them an employee, if it doesn't live on the other side as an employee, then they're going to leave. They're either going to leave or they are not going to help the value that you aspire to be. And so I think that realization that it's not just leaders, it's managers, it's individual contributors, it's the suppliers that we do business with, it's the way that we sell and market ourselves. All of that is a part of that employee cycle. The intentionality and accountability have to be at each one of those points.
Absolutely. Intentionality and really being curious, being open-minded, and also just having that intentionality to create a great place to work where people feel like they can belong no matter where they sit in the organization, no matter how long they've been there as well. Rebecca, Chela, Shalisha, thank you so much for being on our webinar today about how to communicate company culture throughout the entire employee life cycle. Thank you to our live and on-demand audience for listening. If you have any questions, just let us know, but have a great rest of your day, everyone. And we will see you soon for our next webinar. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Shalisha, Rebecca, nice to meet you all.
So wonderful. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.